I should have known something was off the moment Ivy picked up the microphone. We were halfway through Dylan's birthday dinner. The candles on his cake hadn't even melted. Ivy clinked her wine glass, flashed that wide, rehearsed smile, and stood like she was hosting an award show. The room hushed. My son just looked down at his plate. Then she said it. Genevieve has decided to gift us the cottage. She paused for effect. So Dylan can finally launch his business without worrying about overhead. Her voice was sweet as syrup. People clapped, some gasped, then clapped. I sat frozen, the fork halfway to my mouth. My name had been used like a checkbook, and I wasn't even consulted. I watched Dylan smile awkwardly. He didn't deny it. He didn't look at me. He just accepted it, like it was true. The air turned thick. I reached under the table, gripped my purse tighter, my fingers wrapped around the keys. The metal felt cold, familiar, grounding. That house was my husband's legacy. He built it with his own hands after he retired from the docks. We had poured everything into it. I had buried him 10 years ago, right there under the old pine. I thought I would die in that house. Ivy wasn't finished. She smiled wider and added that I had finally realized the house was too much for me. She said she and Dylan would keep an eye on me and make sure I was settled somewhere simpler. The room laughed politely. I didn't. I straightened my back and stared at her, steady. My heart was a hammer in my chest, but my voice didn't rise. I just nodded, slowly, to no one. It was a performance, and I wasn't about to give them the scene they were hoping for. Not tonight. You ever been betrayed with a smile? That's what it feels like when your own family pretends you're just an old woman, foggy-headed, too tired to fight. They wrap the knife in napkins and stick it in while passing the salt. I sat through the rest of dinner like a ghost. Ivy buzzed around the table, topping off glasses, tossing casual jokes. Dylan said maybe 2 words. A neighbor leaned over to me, whispered that it was such a noble thing I was doing. I nodded again, chewing on rage instead of the dry roast beef. After dessert, Ivy kissed me on the cheek and whispered, "Just sign it tomorrow, Mum. We'll take care of everything." That was her mistake. That was the moment she confirmed it wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a plan. A plan she thought I was too old or too soft to stop. I walked out of the dining room without a word, got in my car, and sat behind the wheel with my hands shaking. I drove home in silence. No music, no headlights from behind. Just the sound of the tide rolling in along the edge of the bay. That house wasn't just a place. It was my last piece of peace, and they were ready to steal it with wine smiles and fake concern. Let me ask you something. Has anyone ever tried to erase you politely? Because that's what it feels like when your son lets his wife rewrite your future. You don't disappear all at once. They fold you out of the photo one layer at a time, starting with your voice. But I hadn't gone quiet. I was just waiting. The keys were still in my purse, the documents were still in my safe, and the look on Ivy's face when I didn't react. That look Bubba told me she thought she had already won. She hadn't. And if you're still listening, stick around. Because what comes next? That's when I stopped being the quiet mother-in-law. That's when I started becoming their worst mistake. The next morning, Ivy showed up at my door before I had even finished my coffee. She didn't knock. She let herself in with the spare key I had forgotten she still had. She walked into my kitchen like she owned it. Her voice was soft, sing-song. She asked if I had slept well, then slid a folder onto the table like it was a birthday card. Her nails tapped once on the cover. "Everything's filled out. You just need to sign." I looked at the folder, then looked at her. She wore joggers and a ponytail. No makeup. The innocent look. But her eyes were too alert, calculating. I reached for my cup instead. She took the silence as hesitation or weakness. She leaned forward and assured me the lawyer had double-checked everything, that it was the smart thing to do. Less stress, less maintenance, and besides, Dylan would never let anything happen to me. I sipped my coffee and watched her pretend I hadn't raised him alone. Pretend I hadn't worked double shifts through his childhood to keep this roof overhead. Pretend she hadn't just turned my home into a pawn on a spreadsheet. She didn't stay long, just long enough to plant the idea and leave the pen on the table. Once she left, I went straight to the cabinet and pulled the old red binder where I kept my property records. I checked every page, date, signature. Nothing had changed. Not yet. But I knew what came next. It didn't take long. That week, Ivy insisted I come stay at their house for a few nights. Dylan called too, said he missed me, said they had set up a new room just for me. I almost laughed. The last time I stayed over, I had to sleep in the basement next to the washer. But I agreed, because I needed to see what they were trying to set in motion. The first night, my medication was moved from my purse to the kitchen cabinet. Ivy said she organized it for me. She smiled when she said it. I smiled back. The next morning, my phone was missing. Dylan told me I had left it in the laundry room, but when I checked, it wasn't there. It showed up later that evening in the backyard. No one said anything. That night at dinner, Ivy mentioned casually that I had been a bit confused lately. She said it while looking at Dylan, but loud enough for the whole table to hear. He didn't argue. She said she was worried I might leave the stove on, that maybe the cottage wasn't the safest place for me anymore. I kept chewing my food. The following day, I overheard her on the phone. She was in the den. I was standing in the hallway, behind the half-closed door. She was talking to someone about getting ahead of any mental decline before it becomes a liability. Her exact words. She even mentioned guardianship, said it was just in case things go sideways. My hands turned cold. I slipped out, went straight to my room, and packed my bag. I left without saying goodbye. Back at my cottage, I changed the locks. I drove straight to the hardware store, bought the tools, and installed them myself. It took me an hour. I also called the bank, flagged my accounts, and requested alerts on any attempts to open new lines of credit in my name. Then I walked into the guest room and pulled out the small black safe from the closet floor. The folder Ivy had dropped off was still inside. I flipped through it again. That's when I noticed the last page. It wasn't a deed transfer. It was a power of attorney form. Her name filled the grantee line, and the signature space already had a faint scribble that looked too much like mine. I set it down. My breath didn't come right for a few seconds. There was no doubt anymore. This wasn't overreach or misunderstanding. This was a setup, a planned, strategic removal. They weren't just trying to take my house. They were trying to erase me entirely, legally, financially, and in public image. If I had signed that paper, I would have been done. I would have become the silent, invisible woman they kept in a room and brought out for holidays. No voice, no home, no control. That night, I sat on the porch and stared out at the water. The cottage creaked with familiar sounds. A gull called from the rocks. I could smell the salt and the faint memory of his aftershave on the porch swing cushion beside me. I had promised my husband this home would never fall into the wrong hands. I had kept quiet long enough. The next morning, I woke up with a clear plan. My name wasn't going to be erased. And they were about to learn what happened when the woman they underestimated too many times decided to stand up. 3 days after I changed the locks, the listing appeared. Not in the paper, not on a local flyer board, online, on a real estate website with full photos of the cottage, room dimensions, and a price tag just shy of 2 million. The headline read, "Charming waterfront cottage, motivated sellers, priced below market." Below that, contact info listed a phone number I recognized as Ivy's, followed by her personal email. I scrolled through the photos. Every single one had been taken inside my home. My kitchen, my bedroom, even the porch swing with the worn cushion my husband used to sit on. She hadn't even bothered to hide the family pictures still hanging on the wall. I hadn't authorized a single photo. My throat tightened. It wasn't just offensive. It was illegal. And worse, it was bold. Ivy wasn't creeping around anymore. She had moved into the light, acting like this house already belonged to her. I didn't call her. I didn't call Dylan. I called Nora. She came over within the hour, holding a box of lemon bars and that sharp, focused look she always wore when someone crossed a line. She sat across from me, scrolled through the listing on her phone, and said nothing for a long time. Then she looked up and asked me if I had contacted anyone about elder abuse before. I said no. I didn't even know who to call. Nora nodded once, stood up, and dialed from my kitchen. The next morning, I had an appointment with someone from the county's Office of Adult Protective Services. Her name was Harper Long. She was young, but sharp. She had the kind of voice that didn't apologize for existing, and eyes that didn't flinch when I handed her the fake power of attorney form. She flipped through the papers slowly. Then she asked me for the full story. I told her everything, from the birthday dinner to the missing meds, from the way Ivy whispered things to other people about my memory, to that folder she had pushed across my table like a menu. Harper didn't say much, but when I finished, she nodded and said one thing. "They're trying to build a case that you're incapable, then they'll make it legal." That sentence hit me harder than I expected, not because I didn't know it, but because hearing it confirmed out loud that my own family wasn't just lying to me. They were trying to replace me, legally, publicly, permanently. Harper advised me to do 3 things immediately. First, notify my bank and credit bureaus to flag my identity for any suspicious activity. I had already done that, so she checked it off. Second, have the cottage deed verified by a property attorney to ensure no fraudulent transfers were in process. And third, install surveillance. She said it gently but firmly. If someone was planning to prove I was incompetent, they'd need moments they could twist. Better to have evidence of the truth than scramble to prove it later. That night, I sat at the dining room table with a small notepad and wrote down every strange interaction from the past month. I built a timeline. I included dates, places, quotes, even screenshots from the listing and texts Ivy had sent. By midnight, I had 9 pages. At 1 in the morning, I emailed the entire packet to Harper. By sunrise, she replied. She said she was escalating the case for review and would reach out to the local police if anything escalated further. But even then, I knew I couldn't rely on procedure alone. I needed leverage. I needed something that would make Ivy pause, something that would strike where it hurt most. So I printed out the listing, circled her phone number, and made 20 copies. Then I went into town. I stopped by the coffee shop, the post office, the bulletin board outside the grocery store, and the marina entrance. I didn't tack them up. I just handed them quietly to the right people. I told them this listing was unauthorized. I told them not to call that number. And I told them I was not selling. Some nodded with sympathy. Some gave me quiet looks of disbelief. But they listened. By the afternoon, I had 3 voicemails on my home phone from neighbors asking if everything was all right. That night, Dylan showed up. He didn't call ahead. He just knocked once, hard, then waited. I opened the door. He looked tired, confused. His words stumbled. He said Ivy was upset, that someone had accused her of stealing. that the neighbors were whispering, that Harper had contacted the HOA, and now he didn't know what was going on. I stepped aside and let him in. We sat in the same kitchen where I had once taught him to count change on a Sunday morning. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just pulled out the folder, showed him the form with Ivy's name on it, showed him the page where someone had forged my signature, showed him the printed listing with her contact number beneath the price. His hands trembled. He didn't say a word. He stood up, ran both palms down his face, then left without closing the door behind him. I stood in the quiet for a long time after that, and then I picked up the phone. I had one more call to make. It was time to make sure this house, and everything tied to it, stayed in the right hands. Mine. The morning after Dylan left, I didn't sleep in. I got up before the sun rose and pulled every document I owned out of the safe. The deed, my marriage certificate, my will, the trust agreement my husband and I had signed back in 1994. I laid it all out on the dining room table and took a photo of each page. Then I made copies and sealed them in separate envelopes. One went to Harper, one to my lawyer in Portland, one to Nora, in case anything happened to me. After that, I drove straight to the county clerk's office. By 10 a.m., I had filed a formal affidavit confirming the cottage was my primary residence and that I had never signed, nor authorized, any transfer of ownership or power of attorney to Ivy Collins or Dylan Porter. I had them stamp it 3 times. I watched every mark go down like a nail into a coffin. Then I met with my lawyer. I paid extra to have everything expedited. He drafted a new clause in the deed, something simple, something strong. It said no transfer of the property could occur without my live, in-person signature witnessed by a registered notary and medical attestation of sound mind. I signed it, notarized, filed, backed up. By the time I got home, I had already received 2 emails from Harper. The first confirmed that Adult Protective Services had opened a formal investigation. The second contained a list of steps I could take immediately to protect myself, including locking down all online accounts, checking for any hidden surveillance devices, and reporting any unauthorized entries to the sheriff's department. That night, I slept with one eye open. The next day, Ivy returned. She didn't knock this time. She stood at the gate, shaking it like a dog trying to claw through a screen door. She yelled my name like we were in the middle of some sitcom argument. I watched from the living room window. She was holding her phone, pacing, dialing numbers. I didn't go outside. I let her sweat in the sun for 15 minutes before she finally stormed off. An hour later, Dylan called. I let it ring. The day after that, I went back into town. I met with Marta, the HOA president, at her office next to the hardware store. I handed her a packet of documents. Inside were copies of the listing, the power of attorney form, and a brief statement outlining Ivy's behavior and my concern for reputational harm within the neighborhood. Marta read in silence. When she was done, she said one thing. If Ivy attempts to claim ownership again or disturb the neighborhood peace, she will be issued a formal citation under HOA Rule 3.7. That was enough. But I wasn't done. I took a walk down the marina. Nora met me at the dock with a coffee in hand. We sat on the bench by the water and watched the sailboats drift out of the cove. Then I told her I wanted to make everything public. No more hiding, no more quietly correcting whispers. I wanted the whole truth to come out where everyone could see it. So we made a plan. Nora would help me write a 1-page flyer, clean, clear, factual. No emotional appeals, just bullet points and dates. I would print 50 copies and drop them at every mailbox in the neighborhood. The title was simple: Misrepresentation of ownership and elder manipulation. Beneath that, I included a short timeline, screenshots, and confirmation that the legal ownership of the property remained with me, Genevieve Porter. That night, I sat with the first printed flyer in my hands and felt a new kind of calm settle in. Not silence, not fear, control. But Ivy wasn't finished. 2 days later, someone tried to break into the cottage. It happened at 2:13 in the morning. The motion light snapped on, the side door rattled, and the camera feed I had installed caught a hooded figure fumbling with the handle. The person didn't get in. The new locks held. But I saw enough. The footage wasn't crystal clear, but the frame of the body, the way they walked, the size, the rhythm. It wasn't Dylan. It was Ivy. I called Harper at 7 a.m. She looped in the sheriff. I handed over the video. That afternoon, I was granted a protective order, effective immediately. Ivy was barred from the property. Any future attempt to approach the home would trigger criminal trespass. That same evening, Dylan showed up again. This time, he stood at the sidewalk, hands in his pockets. He didn't shout, didn't demand. He just looked at the porch light and waited. I didn't invite him in. I opened the door and stood at the top step. He looked up, his voice hoarse, and asked if I believed he had known. I didn't answer. I told him I had submitted everything to the sheriff and that Ivy was no longer welcome here. I told him my name was still on every legal record, and that if either of them continued, it wouldn't just be a civil issue, it would be criminal. He nodded once. Then he left. I watched him walk to his car alone. For the first time, he didn't turn around before driving off. When I went back inside, I sat at the table, looked at the stack of documents, and made one last note on the timeline. Attempted break-in. 2:13 a.m. Likely suspect, Ivy. Protective order issued. No more chances. I underlined the last line twice. Then I got up and locked the door. That was the moment I knew. The woman they thought they could silence was fully awake now, and the game had just turned. By the time Friday rolled around, the whole town knew. They didn't say it out loud, but I saw it in the way people looked at me at the post office, in the way they lingered at the bakery a little longer when I walked in. The neighbours no longer waved from across the yard with forced cheer. They nodded, tight-lipped, respectful, and some of them dropped quiet notes in my mailbox. Just 2 or 3 lines. I'm sorry, I didn't know. If you need anything, we're here. But I wasn't looking for sympathy. I was preparing for war. Ivy had vanished from the neighbourhood after the protective order. No more showing up at my gate, no more phone calls. But the silence didn't fool me. She was calculating. That kind of mind doesn't give up. It waits. It hides behind new tactics, which meant I had to stay 2 steps ahead. That weekend I made the decision. If they wanted a fight over this house, they were going to get one. But not on their terms. On mine. I walked into the back room, opened the cabinet behind the old sewing table, and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were the original house plans, the title chain going back 50 years, and the contract my husband and I had signed with the first contractor. I scanned them all and emailed them to Harper. I asked her to forward them to the sheriff's office and to my lawyer. This wasn't just about ownership now. This was about record, paper, provenance. I wanted a wall of evidence so high they couldn't climb it, even if they tried. Then I made the call to the county recorder's office. I filed a public notice. An official declaration of attempted fraud and elder exploitation tied to this address. It wasn't necessary legally, but it was loud, and I wanted loud. The notice went live Monday morning. My name, Ivy's name, the address, the protective order, and a certified statement that any and all transactions related to the property without my presence and explicit notarized consent were to be considered null and void. No one could pretend they didn't know now. That afternoon, Nora came by with 2 coffees and a grin on her face. She told me she'd overheard a conversation at the marina. Someone said Ivy had called a local broker, tried to explain the situation, said the listing had been pulled because of a temporary misunderstanding. The broker told her to come back with full documentation and a clean title history. She never went back. That evening, I got an email. Not from Ivy, from Dylan. It was short. He asked to meet in person. Just him. No Ivy. No lawyers. He said he wanted to talk. I waited a full hour before responding. I told him to come the next day, noon, alone. The next morning I prepared the table, not with food, with paper. I laid out the full folder of documentation. The real deed, the amended trust clause, the protective order, a printed screenshot of the online listing, and at the very top, the fake power of attorney form, side by side with my real signature. When he arrived, he didn't knock. He stood at the door until I opened it, hands in his pockets, looking like a child caught with matches. I didn't invite him to sit. I pointed to the table. He walked in slow, his eyes scanned everything. His mouth didn't open. I let the silence stretch, long enough for him to feel it. Then I asked him to explain what he knew. He said he thought Ivy was just helping. He said he hadn't seen the listing, hadn't looked at the forms. He said she told him I had agreed to everything, that I was tired, ready to let go. I listened. Then I asked him one question, the only one that mattered. Did you ever ask me? He lowered his head. That was the answer. I pushed the folder toward him, told him to read every page, told him I was documenting this meeting, told him any further attempt to manipulate, coerce, or transfer property without my consent would result in legal action, and he would be named alongside her. He looked like he might cry, but I didn't offer him a tissue. I didn't reach across the table. I let the weight of his silence settle exactly where it belonged. He asked if there was any way to fix this. I told him no. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But one thing was certain. This house was not his, and it was never hers. And the fact that either of them thought it could be taken with paperwork and fake kindness told me everything I needed to know. When he left, I didn't watch him drive away. I went straight to the back door and locked it behind him. Then I picked up the folder, walked it to the safe, and closed it tight. That was the end of the polite phase. The gloves were off, and the next move would be mine. 2 days after Dylan left, I got the text. From Ivy. No name, just a number I hadn't seen in weeks. She wrote, "You dragged this too far. We could have handled it privately. Now everyone's watching." I didn't reply. I just read it once, then deleted it. But I knew what that message meant. She wasn't done. She was regrouping. People like Ivy never back down. They recalculate. If she couldn't take the house quietly, she'd try something louder, more humiliating, something meant to break me publicly. So I planned accordingly. The following morning, I walked into town and spoke with Marta at the HOA office. I told her I wanted to host a community dinner. Nothing big. Just a few neighbors, a few familiar faces. I told her I'd be making the food myself, that it would be at my place, and I would handle everything. Marta agreed without hesitation. Said people were talking already. Some were confused, some were supportive. But what they all needed was clarity, and maybe a plate of roast chicken. I spent the next 2 days prepping. Not just the food, the room. I cleared the dining space, brought in extra chairs, set up a small projector on the mantel, and laid out the timeline on poster board. The listing, the form, the power of attorney, the screenshots, the printed emails, the protective order. A full visual layout of what had been done and when. Every item backed by a document. Every document backed by a witness. On the third day, the guests arrived. About 16 people, neighbours, HOA members, a local broker, even Marta. All of them came with polite smiles, polite questions, and a bit of tension in their posture. They didn't know what kind of evening this would turn into. They probably thought it would be awkward. Maybe a little uncomfortable. What they got was a courtroom. I didn't start with a toast. I didn't serve appetizers. I stood at the head of the table and said, calmly, that this was not a dinner party. This was a disclosure. Then I clicked the remote. The projector lit up with the opening slide, the attempted erasure of Genevieve Porter. And I began. I walked them through the timeline. No dramatics, no raised voice. Just facts. What Ivy had done, what Dylan had ignored. The listing, the signatures, the break-in attempt, the stolen spare key, the lies she had fed to the neighbours. Slide by slide, their faces changed. No one moved. No one spoke. I ended with the footage, the security camera clip. The one from the side entrance at 2:13 a.m. The blurry figure, the hoodie, the failed entry. I paused it at the exact frame where the angle caught the profile. It was Ivy. No doubt now. I let the image sit there. No narration. Then I spoke. I told them this home was not for sale. Never had been. I told them that I would be pressing charges if one more unauthorized contact occurred. I told them that I would not be leaving this house. Not in a month. Not in a year. Not unless I was carried out in my own time. The room stayed silent. Then Marta stood up. She looked at the group and said clearly, without hesitation, that the HOA would be issuing a public statement in support of me. That any neighbour approached by Ivy or Dylan regarding the cottage was to forward the communication immediately to legal counsel. That this neighbourhood would not enable or ignore elder exploitation again. The guests applauded, not loudly but firm, unified. I thanked them. Then I served dinner. The mood didn't soften much, but it didn't need to. I wasn't there to entertain. I was there to end the performance. By the next morning, Ivy's name was scrubbed from every local broker's contact list. Her number flagged as high risk on 2 neighbourhood forums. Dylan hadn't called. I figured he wouldn't. Not after what he saw on the table that night. But Ivy wasn't gone. She just went quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes before a final push. So I made one more move. I scheduled a public information meeting at the local library, open to all. Topic: protecting property rights and autonomy for seniors. I partnered with Harper and a local estate attorney. We drafted materials, made a presentation, and opened the floor for anyone in the area who had felt manipulated, pressured, or misled about their property. 37 people showed up. 7 shared their own stories. 2 cried. I stood in the back and watched it unfold. Not as a victim, but as a woman who had just built the one thing Ivy feared most. A voice that could not be ignored. I never spoke her name that day. I didn't need to. She had already lost the room, and she was about to lose a whole lot more. 3 days after the library event, I got a letter. Not from the sheriff, not from the HOA, not even from Harper. It was from Ivy. It arrived in a plain white envelope, slid under my front door without postage. No return address. No signature on the inside. Just 3 pages of typed text, tightly spaced, cold and composed. The first paragraph accused me of ruining her life. The second warned that she had spoken to lawyers and was not afraid to sue. The third reminded me that Dylan was still my only son, and that if I kept pushing, I would lose him forever. I folded the letter once, then I placed it gently into a manila folder labeled Evidence and slid it back into the safe. And then I called Nora. It was time. We agreed on Saturday, noon, one last gathering, not a dinner, not a presentation. This time, it would be a formal, notarized reading, in my house, in my living room, with legal observers. I sent out 5 invitations: Dylan, Ivy, Marta, Harper, and one independent real estate attorney who specialized in elder asset disputes. I left nothing open to interpretation. The invitation read, "You are requested to attend the formal delivery and declaration of intent regarding the full estate and property holdings of Genevieve Porter, with legal counsel present. No questions, no interruptions, no negotiations." Saturday came fast. Ivy arrived first. She wore black, like she was walking into a funeral. Hair perfect, shoes loud against the wood floor. Her smile was acidic, sharp, rehearsed. Dylan followed behind, more hesitant. He looked worn down, hollowed out. But he showed up, which meant on some level he still believed he had a place at the table. Marta came next, with Harper at her side. The attorney, a woman named Lacey Grant, arrived exactly on time. She carried a briefcase and a small recorder, which she placed on the table and turned on without a word. I nodded once, then began. I didn't speak from emotion. I read, clearly, calmly, from the document in front of me. I declared my sole and permanent ownership of the cottage, backed by the filed affidavits, notarized documents, and protective orders already submitted to county and state. I read each clause aloud, pausing only for signatures. Then I turned to the next section, the new trust arrangement. I announced without flinching that I had established a living trust, assigning all control, management, and eventual inheritance of the property to the Haven for Coastal Women, a non-profit organization that provided transitional housing and legal services for elder women recovering from domestic manipulation and displacement. The cottage would remain my residence until the day I chose to leave or passed away. After that, it would belong to the Haven. Not Dylan, not Ivy, not family. The silence was thick. I looked up. Ivy's jaw had gone slack. Her smile evaporated. Dylan sat back in his chair, staring at his hands. I continued. I read from the closing statement, the one Lacey had helped me write the night before. This decision reflects not spite, but clarity. It reflects the consequences of willful deception, coercion, and the attempted erasure of autonomy. No further discussion will be entertained. No revisions. This is final. Lacey collected signatures. Harper filed a notarized witness form. Marta requested a copy for HOA records. Ivy finally spoke. She stood, hands trembling, her voice thin and shrill. She called it theft. She called it revenge. She called me unstable. I let her scream. I let her point. And when she stepped forward like she might come around the table, Harper blocked her path and told her she needed to leave the property. Immediately, Dylan didn't defend her. He didn't say anything at all. He just stood slowly, nodded at me once, then followed her out the door. I didn't walk them out. I didn't look after them. I sat with Lacey and Marta while they made copies of the signed trust and stored them in sealed envelopes. Then I made tea. Later that night, I stood on the porch, looking out at the cove. The sky was low and dark, clouds thick above the trees. I heard the wind rustling through the pine, the faint creak of the porch swing beside me. The cushion still held the shape of the memory. My hands were steady. My house was still mine. And the war, at last, had taken a turn that no one could reverse. Ivy didn't go quietly. By Monday morning, she was on the phone with a local news blog, spinning the story from every angle. She claimed I was unstable, that I had been manipulated by outside forces, that Dylan was being punished for loving his mother. She didn't say my name, but it didn't take much for people to figure it out. The article ran with a headline meant to provoke: "Woman in her 70s cuts out son from will, donates waterfront property to strangers." There was a picture of the cottage taken months ago without permission. The comments section filled up fast. Strangers debating my sanity, my family, my character, like they knew a thing about me. It should have rattled me. But it didn't. It told me I had hit her where it hurt. Because the only thing Ivy loved more than control was image. She needed to win in the court of public opinion, even after losing in the legal one. But what she didn't realize was that I had already prepared for this too. Months back, after that night Dylan left the first time, I recorded a video. Just one. No editing, no performance, just me, sitting in my living room, explaining the story in my own words. I sent that video to the blog editor directly. No drama, no slander, just clarity. Within hours, the post was updated. A second headline appeared below the first. "Retired widow speaks out about elder abuse and property fraud allegations." It included my timeline, the court filings, and Harper's formal statement verifying the protective order and the county's involvement. The damage control Ivy hoped to manage fell apart faster than she could reload the page. By Wednesday, the comments shifted. People weren't calling me irrational anymore. They were calling me brave. Some shared their own stories, some asked for resources, some just thanked me for not backing down. I wasn't doing it for the applause, but I'll admit, it felt good to see the tide turn in daylight. What came next wasn't planned. Harper called and told me she had received a report from a neighboring town. Another woman, age 74. Her grandson had transferred her property deed using a forged signature. She never told anyone. She was living in a trailer behind the property now, while the grandson rented her home on Airbnb. Harper asked if I would meet with her, not as a victim, as a mentor. I said yes. We met the following Friday at the community center. Her name was Lillian. She had sharp eyes and stiff shoulders, the kind that hold weight for too long without rest. We spoke for 2 hours. She cried once, not out of weakness, out of recognition. That night, I decided the trust wasn't enough. The house wasn't the only legacy I could leave. So I started drafting something else, a program, a small legal aid fund tied directly to the Haven for Coastal Women. It would support legal defense and housing protection for elderly women facing family-based property manipulation. I named it after my husband, the Walter Porter Initiative. I called Lacey and set up the paperwork. I called Harper and asked her to help with outreach. I called Nora and asked her to run logistics, community side. By the next month, it was live. That's when Ivy tried one last move. She filed a petition in probate court, arguing that I had made my estate decisions under duress, that I had been isolated by bad actors, that I was mentally vulnerable. She claimed I had been coerced into transferring the property. She brought her own attorney. Young, loud, full of scripted sympathy. But she brought it to the wrong courtroom. Because I walked in with my records, my medical evaluations, my statements, and 3 witnesses who had documented every decision from the day I took back control. Harper was one, Lacey was another, the third was Marta. It didn't last long. The judge dismissed the petition before the end of the hour. Baseless, unfounded, no appeal warranted. Ivy walked out before the ruling was finished. Dylan stayed seated until the room was empty. I passed him in the hallway. He didn't look up. I didn't stop walking. Back at the cottage, I lit a candle in the kitchen, not for ceremony, but for quiet, for breath. I opened the windows and let the evening breeze roll in from the water. The house felt different now. Not defensive, not on edge, free. There were no shadows under the doors, no sounds outside that I feared anymore. I sat on the porch, watched the wind stir the pine trees, and let it all land. Everything they tried to take, everything I chose to protect. This wasn't revenge anymore. It was reclamation. The day the news segment aired, I was making soup, chicken and barley. The weather had turned, and the chill from the bay started creeping through the window frames. I didn't plan to watch it live, but Nora texted me and said, "Turn on channel 7." I turned the volume low, kept stirring, and waited. It wasn't a long segment, maybe 6 minutes total, but it hit hard. The anchor introduced the story with a headline about rising cases of elder property fraud. Then the screen cut to the reporter standing in front of my cottage. Calm voice, neutral tone, but the facts came through with weight. They spoke about the growing pattern of adult children or relatives attempting to seize assets from aging parents through coercion, misinformation, or legal loopholes. They referenced my case, not by name, but clear enough that anyone who'd been following would understand. They even used an interview clip from Harper, talking about protective orders and the trust model I had established. There was no footage of Ivy, no comment from Dylan, only a slow pan across the bay, the porch, and the flyer from the library event pinned to the community board. When the soup was done, I ladled it into 2 bowls and brought one across the street to Lillian. She opened the door with a smirk and said she'd already seen it twice. Said it was about time people stopped whispering and started taking notes. That night, 3 more women reached out. One from the next county, one from a retirement condo near Augusta, the last from 2 blocks over, who I hadn't known by name until now. Each of them had a version of the same story, a daughter or a niece or a grandchild who had tried to quietly move them out, take control of bank accounts, shift power when they thought no one was watching. I invited all 3 to the next community meeting, not as guests, as speakers. By the end of the week, the Haven for Coastal Women had to rent a larger space. 50 chairs, standing room only. When I stepped up to the podium, I didn't speak about Ivy. I spoke about patterns, the kind of silence that families treat as survival, the kind of shame women carry when they lose control of what they've built, the way society treats financial betrayal by loved ones as complicated instead of cruel. I told the room that I was done with polite silence. I told them it was okay to protect what was theirs. And I told them that no matter how late it felt, they still had a voice. The applause after wasn't loud. It was steady. That same night, Marta called. She said Ivy had sent a mass email to several HOA members, attaching a long, frantic letter claiming she had been unfairly vilified, that the town had turned on her, that she had been misunderstood and only ever wanted to help. But no one replied. Not one person. The next day, the local newspaper ran a feature story. Page 4, small headline. But there it was. Genevieve Porter's fight sparks countywide review of elder legal protections. Below the article, a small note said the Board of Supervisors would be meeting to discuss potential legislation aimed at preventing future cases of property manipulation among aging residents. That moment should have been enough. But something in me still hadn't settled. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't justice. It was the last thread I hadn't pulled. I went to the county building, filed a records request, and confirmed what I suspected. Ivy had attempted to register a quitclaim deed 3 months prior. Unfiled, unsigned by me, and marked as pending correction. It listed the cottage's full address and assigned ownership directly to Dylan and Ivy jointly. She had prepared the transfer before the dinner party, before the fake listing, before she ever said a word to my face. That was the truth I needed, not to make her pay, to understand the scope, to know how far it really went. I made copies, sealed them, and handed one to Harper for the formal file. The other went into the safe. Then I changed the locks again. Not because I was afraid, because I was done. Later that week, I sat on the porch while the fog rolled in from the water. It hung low over the bay, soft and quiet, almost like memory. In that stillness, I realized I no longer flinched when the phone rang. I no longer checked the street each time a car slowed down. I no longer waited for the next blow. Ivy was gone. Not physically, but her hold had snapped. Dylan had vanished too. No more calls, no more letters. And that was fine. Some losses aren't meant to be chased. The house was quiet again. Not the kind of quiet that feels like exile. The kind that feels like peace. The kind that comes after a storm, when everything still drips with rain, but nothing's breaking anymore. I sat back in the chair, wrapped the shawl around my shoulders, and breathed. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I had to fight. I had already won. I woke up that morning to the sound of tires crunching gravel. Not the mail truck, not the neighbor's old Subaru. It was a rental, clean, new, the kind that showed up when people didn't want to be noticed, but didn't want to look out of place either. I stayed at the kitchen window and watched as Ivy stepped out. She didn't look the same. Her hair was tied back like she had been rushing. Her blouse was too tight across the shoulders. She held her phone like it was the only thing left keeping her upright. And behind her, stepping out slower, was Dylan. He looked thinner, paler, a little older than just a few months ago. I didn't open the door. I watched them walk to the gate. They didn't ring the bell. They just stood there, looking up at the porch like it still belonged to them. I waited. Eventually, Ivy pulled a thick manila envelope from her purse and pushed it through the slot in the gate. Then they turned and walked back to the car. I waited until the engine faded down the street before I went outside. I picked up the envelope. No return address, just my name. Inside were two things: a typed letter and a certified court summons. The letter was Ivy's, one last spin of the wheel. She claimed she had new evidence. She said I had manipulated Dylan into silence, that I had falsified documents, that the protective order was part of a broader pattern of control. She said she intended to file a defamation suit, along with a motion to challenge the validity of the trust and block any future property transfers. I set the letter aside and looked at the summons. It was real. I was being called to appear at a preliminary hearing. They were making one final play. But this time, it was public. So I responded accordingly. Within 24 hours, my attorney filed a countersuit, not just to defend against the challenge, to expose everything. We submitted full documentation of every communication, every filing, every medical exam, financial record, and audio transcript we had gathered since the first moment Ivy made her move. Harper filed a sworn affidavit. Lacey updated the legal brief with the last set of trust amendments. Marta submitted an HOA incident report cataloguing Ivy's pattern of behavior, including her attempted manipulation of multiple community members. And I gave my final statement. Calm, direct, personal. No embellishment, no anger, just the truth. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday. It took place in a packed courtroom. Small space, no cameras. But every seat was filled. Neighbors showed up. Reporters sat in the back row. And Ivy came in late. Her attorney started loud, claimed elder abuse, community bias, even implied psychological coercion, said Dylan had been emotionally cornered and that I had created a hostile narrative that damaged Ivy's reputation and cost her employment opportunities. Then Lacey stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't move her hands. She just spoke. She listed every date, every notarized document, every protected transaction. She showed the court how Ivy attempted to file a quitclaim deed with forged witness names. She presented the fake power of attorney form side by side with my original signature from 10 separate filings. She played audio from a phone call where Ivy told Dylan, "If she doesn't sign it soon, we'll push her out before winter." That moment changed everything. The room went silent. The judge leaned forward, and for the first time, Dylan looked directly at me. He looked like he had finally heard the truth spoken out loud, with no space left to hide. After a long pause, he stood up and asked the court for permission to make a statement. His voice shook. He said he had known what Ivy was doing. He said he let it happen. He said he was scared of losing both women at once, and in trying to keep the peace, he lost his mother entirely. He said what happened to me was real, and that I didn't deserve it. Then he sat back down. Ivy didn't look at him once. The judge's ruling came quickly. All petitions against the trust and transfer were dismissed with prejudice. The defamation suit was denied on all counts. In addition, the court referred Ivy's forged deed attempt to the district attorney's office for potential criminal investigation. That was the moment the gavel dropped. That was the moment it was over. Outside the courthouse, I didn't speak to Dylan. I didn't need to. He stood at the bottom of the steps while I walked past. There was no anger in me, no victory dance, just peace. The kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission. I climbed into the front seat of Nora's car, buckled the belt, and took one last look at the courthouse through the rearview mirror. It didn't look like a place where I lost something. It looked like the place I took it back. The week after the hearing, the phone barely rang. No reporters, no lawyers, no HOA updates, no new threats. For the first time in months, the house held its stillness without tension. It felt like quiet, not caution. But I knew better than to confuse silence with closure. What was over in court wasn't necessarily over in people's hearts. Ivy had disappeared from town. Word spread she was staying with a friend out in Camden. Dylan hadn't followed her. He stayed behind, though no one saw much of him. A few people mentioned he'd started volunteering at the senior center, helping with paperwork for folks who didn't trust digital forms. I hadn't asked. I hadn't needed to. But on Thursday morning, I found a note on the porch. Plain, handwritten, folded once and held down by a smooth, flat stone. It was from Dylan. The handwriting was uneven, the kind he used when he was trying to control emotion. He didn't ask to meet. He didn't explain anything. He just said he had listened, and he was sorry. For the silence, for the complicity, for standing behind someone who tried to erase me. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just thanked me for surviving it. That was the first time in a long while I felt my hands shake. Not from fear, from something heavier than anger. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of the drawer next to the stove, under the takeout menus I never used. I didn't call him. I didn't write back. But I left it there, where it belonged, because not every apology needs a reply. Some only need room to exist. Later that day, Harper stopped by with coffee and final paperwork. She dropped the file on the table and said it was done. Case officially closed. The investigation into Ivy's actions had been forwarded to the DA, but my name was no longer tied to any open legal concern. She smiled, said the system worked for once. Then she paused. She told me something I hadn't expected. Ivy had filed a formal withdrawal from her attorney's firm. She had waived all future claims. And she had sent one document to the DA's office, a signed affidavit. In it, she admitted to drafting the false quitclaim deed, to using my spare key without permission, to presenting herself as having legal authority she did not possess. It wasn't a full confession, but it was a start. Harper said it wouldn't keep her out of trouble, but it might be the first step towards something that looked like accountability. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel sad. I just felt still. That night, I took down the last flyer on the corkboard near the front door, the one from the community centre that had the meeting dates and hotline numbers. I didn't throw it out. I placed it in a folder marked with the name of the fund, the Walter Porter Initiative. There was no more need for defence. The house was mine. My name was intact. The storm had passed. But the echoes, they lingered. That weekend, Marta invited me to speak at the community brunch. I didn't want to go, but I knew I needed to. The room was packed, folding chairs pushed to every corner, more faces than I remembered, some who had watched from a distance, some who had helped along the way. I stood at the front of the room with a microphone in my hand and told them the story. Not about Ivy, not about Dylan, about what it meant to be seen only as a shadow of who you used to be, what it meant to have your name, your home, your very memory questioned because someone younger decided it was time for you to fade. I told them how hard it is to fight back without losing yourself, and how necessary it is to do it anyway, because dignity is not a luxury, it is a right. When I finished, no one clapped. They stood, quiet, respectful, present. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Weight, leaving. Not everything heals when the battle ends, but some of it begins to. And that is where the real story starts to change. The first snowfall of December had just begun to dust the city when I stepped out of the courthouse that morning. My coat was buttoned high, scarf tucked close to my chin, and in my chest, something had finally settled. Not triumph, not revenge, just peace. The kind that comes after a storm that lasted too long. Inside that courthouse, they had read my new will aloud. Every last word had been made public, and I had watched from the front row as Brendan's face drained of colour. Everything I once planned to pass down to him was now out of his reach. The cabins, the farmland, the investment properties, the summer house where we used to take long drives to with picnic baskets and board games. All of it was gone from his future. Instead, the assets had been moved into a foundation bearing my mother's name. A quiet woman who cleaned schools for 30 years and never had a vacation longer than a weekend. The Marjorie Whittaker Foundation for Women of the Forgotten Generation. It would provide housing, legal help, and education for widowed women over 65 who had been financially cut off by their families. The room had gone silent when the purpose was explained. A silence that felt heavier than any verdict, because the message was clear. This wasn't about bitterness. It was about repair. Brendan had sat with his jaw clenched, shoulders stiff. Kayla had kept her gaze low, her hands clutched together in her lap, turning red at the knuckles. There was no outburst, no apology either, just the weight of knowing they had gambled my worth away for greed and lost everything. When I walked past them on my way out, I paused, just long enough for Brendan to look up. His eyes searched mine, maybe for softness, maybe for a door left ajar, but I didn't offer either. I gave him a small nod, not of affection, but acknowledgement, of what had been, of what would never be again. Outside, the snow continued to fall. I walked slowly, letting it land in my hair. I didn't rush. I had nowhere to be, except exactly where I was, free. That afternoon, I returned to the lakeside cottage I had chosen as my final home. It wasn't large, it wasn't lavish, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living not out of habit, but out of choice. Martina stopped by later that evening. She brought over a tin of her mother's ginger cookies and sat with me near the fireplace. Neither of us said much for a while. The flames crackled. Outside, the lake had begun to freeze along the edges. Finally, she turned to me and said something simple. "You did what needed to be done," and I had. Not because I wanted to hurt Brendan, but because I had to draw a line that said my value didn't end when they decided it did, that I was more than an account to empty, a name to erase, a mother to cast aside when inconvenient. We sat together until the logs turned to embers. Then she kissed my cheek and left. The next morning, I woke to a letter slid under my door. Brendan's handwriting, careful and awkward, like he had written it too many times before choosing the words. I didn't open it. Not yet. Maybe one day. Maybe never. The healing didn't depend on whether he changed. It depended on me choosing to live without waiting. I poured myself a cup of coffee and looked out at the lake, now solid white and still. I thought of all the women I had met these past few months. Women like me. Quiet warriors. I hoped the foundation would find them, help them, remind them they weren't invisible. And I hoped Brendan would one day tell his own children the truth. Not about the money, but about the kind of strength it takes to forgive, even when forgiveness stays silent. For now, I let the snow keep falling. I let the world turn slowly again. And I sat there, wrapped in my sweater, with no more need to prove anything to anyone. I was not a mother discarded. I was a woman reclaimed. If this story stayed with you, maybe because you've lived something like it, or feared you might, I'd love to know. What would you have done in her place? Have you ever had to choose between peace and apology, and found healing without the closure you thought you needed? Let me know in the comments. And if someone you love has ever made you feel invisible, just remember, your story doesn't end there. Not if you keep writing it.